Namaskar, viewers. Welcome back to this exciting show of Sathology Debunking Mythology. Today, we are discussing the great warriors or the war strategies from our ancient Indian warriors, Hindu warriors, or Sanatana Dharma warriors. So, people do not know in Bhagavad Gita it says, Shauryam Dakshyam cha yuddhe cha apalayanam in Bhagavad Gita, that one of the qualities of a Kshatriya is to never show their back on the battlefield. And some of you may find that why in Bhagavad Gita such thing is mentioned, because in this verse happens in the 18th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna says that one of the qualities of a Kshatriya is he never leaves. This is how you recognize a Kshatriya. He never shows his back in the battlefield. He doesn't run away. So that is the tradition of Bharat. So I do not know where the weakness has come from. I think the weakness is not in the warriors of Bharat. The weakness is in the political decision making. But the warriors of Bharat are still there. So we have one a very special guest. He's written 3 books. And one of the books he told me and that caught my attention. And I really want to bring him to all of you. Some of you may already know him through his articles. So let us bring him Anish Gokhaleji. Namaskar.
Namaskar.
So Anish, before we start off, I have one question to you. What inspired you to write all these things?
Right. So I've been interested in reading history, reading books right from a very small age, since I was in primary school, and so that was basic fondness for reading. But then when I started trekking and hiking in the Sahyadri hill forts around Pune and Mumbai region in India, so a lot of these hill forts they have a lot of history associated with Chhatrapati Shivaji, other Maratha rulers, and as I read more and more about them, I got inspired by these stories, and out of this was born my first book, which was about the Maratha Empire from 1740 to 1758, called Sahyadris to Hindu Kush. And first book had come out, and obviously the second topic, what really got my interest was Lachit Borphukan, who was an Assamese general who fought against the Mughals in the 17th century. It was a very unique topic because the northeast part of India is not usually covered in our history textbooks or even in our common knowledge. It is something that we don't really associate with the rest of India, history-wise. But as I read more and more about Lachit Borphukan, I decided to write my second book, that is Brahmaputra on him. And then the same flow has actually carried me to my third book.
So in the main topics that you have covered, because it's covered the war histories of all these great kings. Uh, what is one thing that stands out between the war strategies which is mentioned? Like somehow that history has been completely hidden. Do you know what is the reason behind all these things? Like, can you explain us?
Yeah, so basically, we have a set kind of narrative uh, in Indian history, which is about how the invaders came and every time the invaders were victorious. So this is a kind of narrative that has been fed from colonial times and it has still continued in post-independence India. So all these stories of resistance, whether it is against Delhi Sultanate, whether it is against the Mughals, whether it is against even the British or the Portuguese powers, this is unfortunately got tied into this is revisionist history or this is and unfortunately we get to hear only half the story as far as our textbooks are concerned.
Yeah. I think that's true because most of the people they most of the history that is being taught to the Indian students and also the students abroad about India is that colonizers colonized them, but they don't talk about how the locals fought so much against the colonists. Like the Islamic, there's one
Exactly.
of in my first book, Debunking Mythology, I actually calculated the whole Mughal rule If you look at peacefully war, how much rule they had is not more than 137 years total. The biggest was
Hmm.
Akbar, but after that, nothing, nobody was able to rule peacefully. And that was a startling
Hmm.
finding I had as far as the Mughal rule. They say 1,000 years we ruled.
Yes.
Obviously, they ruled, they attacked 1,000 years, I would say, but ruling was a different thing. If it was not for
Right.
1947, Pakistan and Bangladesh won't be there. 1947 division, so they snatched those Hindu lands through scheming with Indian National Congress and British, obviously. So otherwise, Pakistan and Bangladesh won't be there. Same as with Afghanistan, the Durand line also. They conquered, they fought for 900 years for Kabul. Most of the historians won't
Yes.
agree, but I was just going through the dates, and 900 years they fought for Kabul from 653 AD till 1100, till 1400 they fought for Kabul. So Kabul was a
Yes.
Hindu city. So I'm saying that it was not as if they walked in and we welcomed them. It was a fight, and all that
Right.
history is not there.
Yes.
So I think you're doing a great work in that. So tell me
Thank you.
about something about the specific war strategy, like you said about the
Yes.
Bajirao Peshwa. What is the war strategy he
Yes.
used and how he fought? So before you tell us that how big was the army and what he fought against and why did he use the strategy what he used his strategy for?
Right. So basically, we're taking up two battles. One is the Battle of Palkhed, which happened in 1728 AD, and the second is the Battle of Vadgaon, which happens much later, 1779. And the reason I take this is it shows very distinct military strategy. In fact, the Battle of Palkhed had been mentioned by Field Marshal Montgomery in his very uh, famous magnum opus called The Concise History of Warfare. So this Concise History of Warfare is a book that is around 800 pages, something 600 to 800 pages, and it contains everything from Sun Tzu right up to the First World War. It is a complete magnum opus as far as warfare is concerned. And obviously, he was a soldier who fought in both the world wars. So he mentions India in 2 pages, and out of these 2 pages, half a page taken up by the Battle of Palkid. So one criticism of the book is yes that he finishes India in time. Out of those 2 pages, he devoted 25% of the space to the Battle of Palkid. And when we study this battle, we actually find out as to how important it is. We are looking at a 27-year-old Peshwa at this point of time. Bajirao, the commander of the Maratha forces, the Peshwa, he was only 27 years old, and he was against an enemy called the Nizam ul Mulk, who was at least had been in the region for minimum of 10 years prior to the battle. And by complete use of the terrain, we find that there is a complete change in tactics by Marathas. At that point, they had been mainly fighting in the hills, ravines, using small forces, hidden attacks, guerrilla attacks. But now, Peshwa Bajirao takes this strategy into the plains, and he manages to deploy his cavalry over an area that is nearly 2,500. Manages to take his cavalry around 2,500 miles and trap the Nizam at a place called Palkhed, where the uh, high point of this is that no major battle takes place with the Nizam. He manages to act in such a way that all kind of food and water supplies are in the hands of the Marathas. And the Nizam is forced to come to terms for the lack of water because he just doesn't have a single drop of water to feed his army. He has to come and surrender. This is the beauty of the whole campaign. That without having a single large battle being fought, he manages to do this, and it's a very unique strategy. It was not repeated in India, and in fact, there are very few examples worldwide also of such rapid cavalry moves. In fact, the only rapid cavalry move we can think of is about the maybe Scythian warriors who came down on the horseback, and maybe the Mongol warriors who used cavalry to such effect. But while everybody is, of course, very familiar with the Central Asian horses and how their cavalry, not too many know about the Battle of Palkhed. Similarly, come to the Battle of Vadgaon later on, where I talk about the Scotch policy, like I had mentioned, in that Napoleon's campaign on Russia, which was a grand failure. In fact, it's counted as failure which began his end. So Napoleon's grand Russian campaign, which ended in a grand failure because the Russians adopted a policy known as the scorched earth. That is, they burned everything in their path, everything in the advancing army's path. In fact, it is presumed that even Moscow was burnt so that Napoleon's army couldn't feed themselves when they invaded the country. And while this has been recorded as a great military tactic, etc., everything which it was, in fact, 20 years prior to this, the Marathas, Nana Fadnavis, and in fact, deployed the same strategy against the British, that is, East India Company. And it was East India Company which had been defeated and had to come to terms in 1779. So, this is an example we find that it doesn't find mention in either history textbooks or even mention of this subject where you talk about military strategies. Palkhed and Varga don't really get a mention. So
I think
I'll
for
be
more details,
explaining more about that.
yeah, for more
Yeah.
details, viewers can definitely access your books. Uh, but uh,
Yes. So
but the but the point is that why? So, what do you say is the reason the Indian educational books doesn't show the history of the great warriors of Bharat?
I don't know. I think that first of all stems from inferiority complex kind of thing. Uh, that the British and others have actually come and given us certain culture, a certain progress. In fact, even when we talk about the railways and other things, the British have gone to great pains to see to it that the Indians did not learn the technology. Uh, but this inferiority complex existed, and plus we tend to put it into kind of a bracket that if you talk about pro-Indian history, it is then bracketed into saffron or Hindutva or that kind of category. And what is to be taught is supposed to be sanitized and whitewashed secular history, is that the actual history of the country doesn't come out. Obviously, political considerations and political leanings have governed this, unfortunately, because I frankly believe that history, whatever it is, should be taught and it should be left to the children as to what they want to interpret out of it.
No, I think
But
selective. There is a selective teaching of history.
yes, definitely.
There is a forced image which is being forced upon Hindus is that you don't have any warriors, you have no one to protect you, and the whole idea is to make them feel so low so that they don't care. They become totally dependent on other people, and
Yes,
that's
there is a word.
actually a war strategy by the British as well as the Islamists.
Yes. So there's a word called deracination, or this is called uprooting. And this is also part of it that you are then, you don't know about this history. Obviously, there's no pride in this history. And automatically then leads to being more favorable towards colonial history or what is, the Islamic invasions which happened. And this deracination means that you're not proud of your own roots, own country. It
Yeah, I
leads
think
to a very
secularism.
negative image. It's very negative image, and it's also something known as self-flagellation. So we are actually very fond of blaming ourselves for our problems, and so the whole narrative doesn't really match up to it. That there had been, successive occasions where invaders were resisted, were defeated. Of course, yes, there were occasions where Indian power were also defeated. I'm not saying that we should have a totally 180-degree opposite version where you put a textbook where everything is about how we won. But there has to be a balance. We need to take an objective view of things. Uh, there is too much emotion involved, obviously, and the objective view as to why were victories scored, uh, and what the losses were and why were these losses suffered by Indian powers. Such kind of objective learning is not there. It's more of a drilled lesson that this is how it is going to be, and you have to rote learn it and write it down. So this objective learning, analytical thinking of historical events. So there is no encouragement for thought in a history classroom. You won't find a teacher anytime going and asking, okay, fine, this is the situation. What do you think would have happened, if decision had been taken differently? Because obviously it's in a realm of fantasy as to what will happen if a decision goes differently. But then this is how you're going to make people think and learn something from that situation. I think we.
No, you're right, because the self-flagellation you said, and also it is a war strategy to destroy the self-confidence of the enemy. So they said you have no history, we have ruled over you for 1,000 years.
Right.
If I calculate the British rule, other than
Right.
the East India Company, it's only 99 years, not more than that. So East India Company
Yes.
was not the ruler of
Yes.
India. 1857 to 1947 is 90 years. So it's a total propaganda war. It's still going on. If you go to
In fact,
the
I wouldn't.
yeah.
No, continue. Please continue.
So if you go to Pakistani textbooks or even Arabic, in the Arabic textbooks, describe Hindus as dark, ugly, weak people, very
Hmm.
cunning, like all the negative things they teach their children. And the same
Yeah.
thing is being taught in the madrasa in India. And the same thing is happening in the US also now. It's like first you make the locals feel guilt and then you badmouth them. It's like they're calling it white supremacist in America. So naturally they
Hmm.
try to defend themselves. No, we are not supremacists. Immediately they have an upper hand because this is a all war strategy. And I think Islam religion as religion has been extremely good in creating deception. So now coming back to the question with you is, so can you tell us more about particular war strategies of Palak, which you were showing me earlier on your slides, so that we learn what was the strategy?
Okay. Right. Uh, so basically, what we're talking of is the Maratha Empire. So at this point of time, it occupied a small area around what is today Pune and Mumbai, so those parts. And the main adversary was the Nizam of Hyderabad. Of course, the Nizam of Hyderabad then survived right up to 1948. But in 1728, what was happening is that this Nizam of Hyderabad had taken control of some part of South India, and what he wanted to do was wanted to invade West, capture whatever of was left of the Marathas, and then establish his entire rule all over the Deccan. To oppose him was Peshwa Bajirao, who obviously was the prime minister of the Marathas. At the point, he was 27 years old, and he was more or less something like the army commander. So the Nizam attacked Pune. I think I have a slide. Hold on.
Yeah, sure.
I think I just start sharing the screen. Hold on. Right. So yeah, this is Pune. Okay, right at the bottom side or the left hand side bottom, you can see a blue line passing through Pune, slightly to the southeast of Mumbai. So this Pune was basically the capital sort of the uh, Maratha Empire at that time. Plus also the Chhatrapati was at Satara. Okay. So now the Nizam of Hyderabad had a very simple strategy. He wanted to attack Satara and Pune, draw the Peshwa out onto the plains. Now, these cities of Pune and Satara actually they have very flat plain areas around them. Although they themselves are on a sort of a plateau or a hill, around them a flat area. Now, Nizam of Hyderabad was moving with guns, cannons, lot of heavy artillery. If he had been faced in the open, Peshwa Bajirao would have got totally decimated because the Marathas did not have any kind of heavy artillery. So now the strategy had to change because the Marathas under Peshwa had cavalry. They had very swift cavalry and a lot numbers of cavalry. But what it did not have is that guns, artillery, what we call the Tof Khana. This was something that it lacked. So the whole strategy of trying to face the Nizam in the open would have been a failed strategy. It would have completely decimated Peshwa Bajirao. What he did instead was that he began moving out of Pune and Satara. He moved north. Then he crossed the river Godavari at one point. He moved east then towards a place called Akola, which is about 400 kilometers from this junction which you see in the center of the screen, past Aurangabad. When he moved, so what the strategy of trying to adopt is that strategy is trying to adopt is that if the Nizam was going to attack my territories, I'm going to use a offensive defensive action in that I'm going to attack the Nizam's territory so as to wake him up and bring him back to his own country. So this is the kind of strategy that even Chhatrapati Shivaji had adopted about 100 years prior, and it is a strategy that has been adopted many a time by great military leaders throughout the world. Is that if your own territory is getting attacked, then don't just stand and try to defend it, because if there is a loss, there's going to be your own loss. Nobody else is going to lose anything. The biggest lesson to learn from this is that Chhatrapati Shivaji as well as Peshwa Bajirao saw to it that cost was imposed on the invading army rather than just trying to defend their own piece of land within their own borders. So in consequence with this, what Peshwa Bajirao did was that he moved towards Aurangabad, which was the Nizam's capital. He attacked it, then he moved even further east. The whole action drove the Nizam out of Satara and Pune. Now, what he was doing was attacking Pune, Satara to establish a supremacy. Now, he suddenly finds that his own capital of Aurangabad is under attack. Now, it is no use trying to attack your enemy's territory when your own capital is getting attacked. He completely withdrew from the Pune Satara region and started chasing Peshwa Bajirao. Now remember, the Peshwa is carrying very swift and fast cavalry with him, which can move and cover maybe 50-60 course a day, maybe more. And the Nizam is carrying his artillery slowly across the plain. The Peshwa then moved west. He headed towards Baranpur. Baranpur is on the border of Maharashtra and Madhya Pradesh today, somewhere around here. And this was something very alarming for the Nizam of Hyderabad because Baranpur was seen even then as a kind of a model Mughal city, a jewel in the Mughal Empire. And for the Nizam to suddenly find Peshwa Bajirao moving towards it, he found it very distressing. And so he continued his chase. Peshwa Bajirao did not attack Baranpur. He in fact slipped past south of it and went further west towards Surat. Now, all this, what is happening is that the Peshwa was always 1 or 2 days ahead of the Nizam. And by adopting this strategy of swiftly moving across the plains of Maharashtra, he had managed to thwart or ward off one danger. And if you see all these red arrows together, it's about 2,500 miles of traveling in total, which is done about 15-20 days with halts and everything, but still it is a lot of distance to cover. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, Montgomery has mentioned this Palkhet campaign of Bajirao I, where he outgeneraled the Nizam ul Mulk. Eventually, what happened was that the Nizam then turned, other time it turned south towards Satara, and Peshwa Bajirao also turned south towards Pune. They came up to a river called Godavari. In fact, there was a crossing place called Puntamba. Now, Peshwa Bajirao had chosen his place very cleverly, that is Palkhed, and Palkhed was very close to a crossing point known as Puntamba on the river Godavari. In those times, obviously, uh, rivers could not be bridged very easily. So it's not like let us construct a bridge at this point and this bridge can be constructed. Shallows or places where naturally bridges had been formed, etc., had to be used or utilized for crossing armies. Yes, there were provisions where you could put across a bridge of boats, but that was expensive. Plus, at the same time, you needed to have all those boats with you to cross the river. So, places where the river was naturally shallow were of great strategic importance because that was the only place in miles upon miles where army could actually cross over. And Peshwa Bajirao reached this point called Palkhed. Now, something very interesting about this route is that so the Nizam then moved north because from Palkhed the Peshwa could easily attack Aurangabad a second time to the east. And the Peshwa also knew that if the Nizam had to proceed, he needed to cross this river at Puntamba because that was the only crossing point available. This is where the second part of the story comes in that Peshwa Bajirao had an excellent intelligence department. He knew exactly where was the Nizam. Was at this point somewhere near Ahmednagar to the south. You can see at the bottom of the screen, yellow dot is Ahmednagar. He found out that he is at Ahmednagar. He intends to cross the river Godavari at Puntamba and come to Palkhed, where he is going to trap the Peshwa. So what the Peshwa does is, after finding out this that he's going to proceed this way, the Peshwa completely took control of all the food and more importantly the water sources of that region of Palkhed. There was a small river called the Shiv River flowing near Palkhed, maybe just to the north of it, and there were a tribe known as Banjaras, which basically dealt with supplying armies with food. They would basically sell food to any army, whether it was whichever way it is. So all these Banjaras were actually purchased or taken into confidence by Peshwa Bajirao. And so when the Nizam actually crossed over, now what he did was the Nizam had to do it quickly because he couldn't wait 4 or 5 days to cross over because Peshwa Bajirao would by then move to Aurangabad. He crossed over alone without his artillery and was completely surrounded by Bajirao. Now remember that the Godavari is with Bajirao, the Shiv River is with Bajirao, all the food sources are in control of the Marathas. And in this situation, that the Nizam was forced to spend 1 or 2 days without having a single drop of water supplied to his army. So this is the beauty of the campaign that he managed to strategically draw such a net around the Nizam of Hyderabad that for 2 days there was no water supply. Now, without food, perhaps a person can survive maybe 4 days, 5 days, maybe more days. But without any kind of supply of water, it is impossible to survive more than 2 days also. So obviously Nizam then tried to fight his way out, which was totally impossible. And he immediately came to terms and he signed a treaty which involved giving away large parts of land, and he had to completely withdraw his army from the Maratha territories. And so at Palkhed, 27-year-old Peshwa had actually shown kind of military strategy and acumen that was far more superior to the one displayed by somebody who was perhaps even twice his age, that is the Nizam. It is one of the very important military strategies we get to see in the Maratha Empire.
No, very good, extremely good, because I think there is a general impression which is being taught to the Western audience as well as to the Indian audience is that Indians did not defend well. And my question is, like I said earlier, that Islam has been trying to, if it was not for the British, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh were all part of Hindu territories. And so much of genocide of Hindus would not have happened there. So British, it is a, but we can never say that Hindu community was weak. They defended very well. I mean, even after, there is a well-known fact: 17 years, Iran converted to Islam in just 17 years. 15 years, Iraq converted to Islam. India, they had to fight for thousands of years, and today also we are the majority. So, in fact, Hindus have
True.
won the war. Same with the Christian missionaries, and in the form of British rule, they were also defeated in 1947. So, as a Hindu country, Hindu India has never been colonized completely for a long time. It has always come back.
True.
But the wrong history has been taught, and to destroy the confidence of Hindus and also defenders. It's a very unique story in the world. Attackers attack and then they call themselves victim in the name of human rights. That's a new war strategy. And then so there is no, they don't even want to acknowledge the right to defend. So immediately
True.
human rights. So human rights is being used as a war strategy nowadays. So what do you have to speak on that?
Yes, so obviously this is something that has come from the left, and while today it is more about what is happening in the US and Europe, but this kind of having a soft corner for you know uh, terrorists or whatever you call urban Naxals, this is something that has been going on in India since quite some time. What it is something we call the fifth column, and there's always been this category which has come out with human rights, etc., etc. There are any number of cases. Now, obviously, the Naxalism problem has started coming down uh, because of a lot of concentrated effort by the central government. But if you remember, around from the year say 2000 or 2004 thereabouts to the next 5-10 years, every time there used to be some kind of operation against the Naxalites, there used to be one bunch of people who would stand up and start shouting about human rights, etc., etc. And of course, there is also this group who starts talking about human rights. So every time there is a terrorist attack in Kashmir, which has been repulsed by the Indian army. So this is not new. It is an old strategy. Obviously, people are seeing through this strategy that you cannot go around batting for terrorists and exilites.
No, thank you so much, I think, for your time. But one last question, and this comes from the audience, is that first of all, they want to know if their book is available on Amazon.
Yes. My first book, unfortunately, that is the Sahyadri Shri Hindu Kush, that is currently not available. It's still in the process of getting converted to Kindle. Uh, the remaining two books, Battles of the Maratha Empire, is available on Amazon Kindle. So those of you who are anywhere in the world, US, UK, India, uh, it is available on Amazon Kindle. So definitely you can buy it. It has about 20 battles of the Maratha Empire, and I focused actually on the strategies and how the reasons why the battles took place. What were the positives for the Marathas? What were the negatives? So it's launched in about June. By now, about 100 copies on Kindle itself. So that is one book you can access on Kindle, Battles of the Maratha Empire. And secondly, a book on Lachit Borphukan, that is Brahmaputra, that is available as a paperback on Amazon India. Um, Again, it's not available outside, but on Amazon India, you can definitely obtain it anywhere in the country.
Now, one last
So,
question
yeah.
is that what is your message to the Indian, actually the people of India, that so much misinformation is being fed, like thousands of years of Mughal rule, which never actually happened, Taj Mahal, all these, so much fake news has been sold as a real history. And we all know that British banned Kalaripayattu, they banned Mahabharata to be taught, and there's a misconception fed to the society that Mahabharata is, if you keep Mahabharata in the home, then it creates fights. All this is bad propaganda. So
Yes.
what is your message to the Indian audience as well as to the American audience about the actual, what was the reason behind all these things by Muslims as well as in British?
Right. So basically, as I mentioned, the textbooks obviously follow a kind of narrative. So obviously, we, with the advantage of now social media, with the internet, we can access a lot of materials which are not accessible maybe 15, 20 years ago, when all we had to read from were textbooks. But now, obviously, there is a lot of material available on the internet. So learn to question whatever is written and go for, opposing views, opposing opinions about the subject. So the textbook should not be the only source of information as far as history is concerned, because it has been written with a certain slant, a certain narrative in mind. There are obviously very good authors. In fact, I would suggest, if you are going to ask me to suggest authors, R.C. Mujumdar is one author I would definitely suggest for Indian history. He's written in English, and I believe for most of his books are available on archive.org now for free, because I believe he passed away in 1950 something. So R.C. Mujumdar is one very good author as far as Indian history is concerned. He doesn't mince words while writing, and he's written very professional books, not having any kind of a slant. Unfortunately, his books, in fact, he was very much present and existing when the country got freedom and the first textbooks were going to be drafted. But our first education minister, being Maulana Azad, um, this kind of a triumphant Hindu history was not allowed to be included into the textbooks, and it stayed that way. But his books are available. R.C. Mujumdar is one. Uh, then, if you are going to go for Maratha history, you have somebody called Sardesai. On Mughal history, particularly on Aurangzeb, I would prefer going for Yadunath Sarkar, who has written 5 volumes on this topic, and he has categorized everything, including the temple destruction, etc., etc. Everything is there. It is not the whitewashed Aurangzeb that you find nowadays, uh, being put in bookstores by a certain lady author. So, so these are the 2, 3 books I definitely suggest for medieval Indian history. And as far as British are concerned, yes, so there was British Empire, but again there is a lot of misconception as to how. One great misconception is that the Mughals were succeeded by the British Empire. So this is one conception that I try to remove in Battles of the Maratha Empire, where I have described some of the important battles which took place between the British and the Marathas, battles which the British themselves have called their toughest test in India. The British commanders and what soldiers who fought in those battles have themselves written memoirs and written that this was our toughest test in our entire life, fighting against Indian soldiers in India. And so there is one narrative that the Mughals came and went, and after that the Britishers directly came. So this is a false narrative which I try to break in my empire.
See,
And
sometimes I've seen that Hindus and the Indian community, Hindu community, becomes very happy when the opponent praises them. And even if they lose the war, they wait for the recognition. Yes, हारने के बाद भी थोड़ा अच्छा खेले. It's like, why is that mindset? Why not fight for win?
no, the reason I mentioned it is that because the whole narrative is about how the Mughals went away and then the British came. There is no part of Indian history which mentions that, about example, this Peshwa Bajirao, which mentions that there was a Hindu empire in the 18th century, and it was this defeat in order to, take control of India, that is East India Company. And as far as adversary is concerned, I believe if the adversary is powerful, has actually shown his prowess on the battlefield, then in that case, if he is praising, I don't think it's a bad thing, because it is in fact a battlefield victory that has been scored. Because similarly, find letter of Abdali, the Mughal saying that if there was anyone who could defeat me in India, it is the Marathas. After winning Panipat, he says this. We have to again understand that although Abdal is an invader, he was also a very efficient army commander and a very efficient ruler of his men. So, in this sense, yes, we do agree that when somebody on the other side is in a position of power and says this, then the words carry weightage. Problem is when we start treating any word which comes out of a foreigner as gospel truth, if I can use that word. So when we start taking the opinion of any kind of European or Western mind as something great just because happens to be from the West, then it's a problem. But if you have qualified people who have actually achieved something in their field and then they go on to praise, I don't think it's a problem really. Same goes with this fellow called Montgomery. I realize this guy is a field marshal. He has fought in 2 world wars. He has fought in other wars also. So he's an established military commander, whatever country he is. I mean, military commander. So if such a person praises Peshwa Bajirao's military tactics and military strategy, obviously we need to listen because his knowledge of strategies is much greater than me and you. And
That's
similarly,
true.
when we have General Lake and General Wellesley. In fact, General Wellesley was asked a question after winning Waterloo. Duke of Wellington, also known as Arthur Wellesley, after winning Waterloo against Napoleon, he was asked which was your toughest battle. Without pausing, he answered, "My toughest battle was a battle in India called the Battle of Asai." So, when opinion of foreigners such as Wellesley and Lake is concerned, who actually fought those battles and had a history of long string of victories with them, when they start talking in terms of facing their um, most stern test in India, it is obviously something to be taking note of and to be proud of, in fact.
No, I agree with you. My point was not that. My point was that what is that Indian mindset? Now, you already answered it actually, that it is in the war, the strategies of Indians were really appreciated, but they lost due to some insufficient resources or whatever. But my question was more on the Indian mindset. Why why when the Bhagavad Gita tell them not to run away from battlefield, why accepting defeat as a victory and then wait for the opponent to praise it? Now, I will also tell that Indian army also praised and Pakistani army general who fought in a war, one of the wars, they praised him because of his valiant fight. But I do acknowledge that it is a sign of magnanimity and broad-mindedness to appreciate the opponent. But from the perspective of defender, it is actually not a glorious thing because you lost the war, you lost the land, and then they're still here.
Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, between defeat and victory, obviously you got to choose victory. Again, you go back to the defeats, and for us, obviously, the most important thing is to assess why those defeats took place. Yes, Bhagavad Gita says that Kshatriya should not run away from the battlefield. But in spite of that, political decisions had been such that defeats did happen. And one of the drawbacks is that there are very few cases of Indian rulers actually going into enemy territories and trying to annex territory and trying to give a dose of their own medicine to an opponent party. Uh, Most of the Indian kings, even when they defended, they were content with guarding their own border. There are exceptions.
Yeah,
There are
but
Parathas are
actually,
exception. The Oriental rulers are exceptions. Vijayanagar is an exception.
yeah.
But somewhere
Unless you take the war into
in
an
few
enemy
places,
territory.
yes.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead.
So this whole action of trying to invade enemy territories and then trying to consolidate themselves. Uh, Unfortunately, there are not too many examples of this. We find that when the whole of North India was getting invaded by Muhammad Ghori and Muhammad Ghaznavi, the south of the country only one occasion did they unite their armies and try to ward off somebody in the ninth century. But after that, we find that even though the North has been fighting, the South did not send armies to guard it, because this whole strategic thinking that problems of the North will one day come to the South did not exist, which is why they lost. And there are many such examples where not trying to carry the battle into the enemy territory and being content with being protective of what was their own land caused a lot of defeat, because the enemy could then regroup and come back, which is what happened in the case of Muhammad Ghori. They got defeated once, he went back to Ghazni, but he was not chased all the way there. Completely regroup his army, then come back to India and again attack a second time.
So, thank you so much, Anish, for your time today. And I think we have went way past our time, which is allotted to this. Thank you. Very interesting conversation, and viewers
Thank
also
you. Thanks a
enjoyed
lot.
it. And so, thank you, Anish. So, when you're back, we'll have another session. Till then, viewers, keep watching, keep subscribing to Sathology, and see all the exciting content that comes out. Don't forget to press the notification tab, otherwise, you won't get notified when we have a daily new content coming out. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.